I know what you're thinking. Mr. Simpson's just got ridiculously good looking. You'd be wrong. My name's Miss Owens and I'm here for your second instalment of GCSE summarising what we've been learning this week. So as the wonderful Mr. Simpson did summarise for you last week, we were talking about the 1920s and the boom. Generally, why it was such a fantastic time to be an American citizen. Not obviously for everyone, when we think about the minorities, Black Americans, Native Americans, etc. But for the majority, it really was a fantastic time to be alive. So, you are all familiar with the cycle of prosperity. We have here jobs being created, jobs easy to find, that's given people loads of dollar. With that dollar and their wages, people are buying stuff. That increases demand for manufacturing because people need the goods, so the factories need to expand. That's causing the requirement for even more jobs, hence jobs are created. You're familiar with this, we've done it every lesson. So what do people buy with all their money? Well, that's a fantastic question, viewers sitting at home. Well, actually one of the things that they did buy, they weren't allowed to buy, and that's because the amendment made alcohol illegal. People thought it was bad, degenerate, made people have accidents, especially in cars. There's so many cars on the road now due to the Model T that people were sick of drunk driving.
I'm drunk!
And they were sick of the way that people conducted themselves when they were drunk. So they made alcohol illegal. This opened up a fantastic gap in the market for people such as Al Capone to come in and exploit. So here we have moonshine, that is illegally brewed alcohol that he was shifting across Illinois. Al Capone was running a gang which was turning over nearly $100 million a year. This was big money, and in New York there was actually 3 times as many speakeasies, which were illegal clubs, as there were after Prohibition in comparison to how many there were before Prohibition, so obviously it didn't work. Al Capone and his rival gang, Bugs Moran, started getting really bad reputations. One of the worst events that happened in American society at the time was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where actually Al Capone killed 7 of Bugs Moran's gang. That was his rival gang. Not good. So, Al Capone, making loads of money, totally corrupt police systems. Times are good for some, bad for others. Depends how you want to look at it. When you come to analyse society, it's up to you to decide. Speakeasies were fun. You had the introduction of things like flappers, that's flappers with an F. We had the liberation of women. Yes, people were going out and having fantastic times. Jazz music was at an all-time high. But really, gangland murders and Prohibition, it wasn't good. But what else were people indulging in? Well, they were indulging in shares. And what they were actually doing is they were buying on the margin. That basically means getting credit. So much like a credit card in today's times. Confidence was at an all-time high. Even shoe shiners in New York were giving stock market advice. That's pretty scary. But, like all good things, they will come to an end. The problem was that America was making so many goods, manufacturing increases, giving people jobs. But the problem was, when you got 1 car, you didn't need 2. Or if you had 1 fridge freezer, there was no need to have 8, or 7, or 6, or 5, or 4, or 3, or 2. Just 1.
That's number 1.
So, people stopped buying stuff. Now the problem with that is, when you oversaturate a market and you give people too much choice, but there's not the demand for it, there's no need for manufacturing to increase. The problem there is that manufacturing is happening, but the companies still owe the banks money. The problem is, if people aren't buying the goods, then the companies don't have any money to pay back banks with. That's a problem. So when people aren't buying stuff, manufacturing increasing, not really. They're going to have to start making redundancies, cutting the costs in their company because they owe money to the bank. Therefore, jobs are no longer created. But you'll remember, people have bought things on credit because they've been so confident. So people get wages, not anymore, but they owe the banks money and the companies owe the banks money. The banks are so unregulated at this point. The banks are saying, give us all your money, but there's no money to have. There we see the beginning of the bust. So, the bust. So by 1929, we have something called the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash was a huge event. It actually affected the whole global economy. You'll remember some of that from your German unit anyway. Wall Street completely disintegrated. This cycle of prosperity that we don't have it anymore. But what we do have is that we have a lot of things on credit still, which isn't being able to pay back. And we also have a lot of goods that we've manufactured. The issue is, because America was trying to keep money in America, other countries have put up import tariffs because America didn't want to do business with other countries. So other countries got pretty stroppy and they put up their tariffs as well. What that meant essentially is that America had loads of consumer goods, no one to sell them to, so there wasn't any way for the businesses to make that money as well. The other problem is, of course, that the government at the time is laissez-faire. That's just the French fancy word for leave it alone. So they didn't really want to intervene. By allowing the economy to recover, allowing it all to sort itself out, that was a much better way than interfering. The laissez-faire policy was indeed a Republican policy. I'm not going to try and draw an elephant. So what we have now is a government that doesn't want to interfere with society. It doesn't want to interfere with the banks. By 1933, 15 million people, that's over half of the workforce in America, were unemployed. 50% of the banks in the USA had failed. Actually, 27 out of the 50 states didn't even have a single bank in them. That's massive. And the government still didn't want to intervene. This led to people actually leaving their towns, leaving their homes. They were known as hobos. They would walk for a long way, trying to find jobs, and they'd set up camp in a thing called a Hooverville. Why a Hooverville? Well, President Hoover was obviously in charge at the time, and his laissez-faire policy led to these shanty towns being built. So it's fair to say by 1932, times had never looked so bad in America. The days of the boom were over, Al Capone's glory days were over, massive production, Wall Street has crashed. The only thing that could change it now is potentially a new government. So, could times change with the new election? Find out next week.